We now turn to Mike Winger's points 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, depending on which of his two lists you happen to be looking at, in his video asserting Psalm 22 as prophecy regarding the Passion of Jesus. We're going to bundle these together because they are closely related. The first point Mike wants to make is that the author of Psalm 22 is rejected by the people in the same way that Jesus is rejected by the people at his trials and crucifixion. Secondly, he wants to equate the verses of Psalm 22 which speak of the narrator's perpetual faithfulness to God to Jesus' own unwavering faithfulness. So you have in Psalm 22 a pious, faithful, lifelong follower of Yahweh who is being rejected by the people, and that parallels what happened to Jesus in the gospel narratives. It's not at all unusual to find in the Hebrew Scriptures a person who is a pious individual, so that alone is not something you should think of as unique. But it's this coupling with the rejection of the people that has apologists like Mike all aflutter. But it's rather an unfortunate use of the term by Mike, rejected. Because if we look through Psalm 22, we really don't find anything about the psalmist being rejected in the way Jesus is rejected in the gospel narratives. Mike specifically calls out verse 6 through 8, and they read, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." The sense of Psalm 22 is of a person who has befallen a prolonged time of misery, and who has now come to the attention of other people. These people see the person's misery and think that, contrary to his assertions, he isn't as pious as he claims. They point out, sarcastically in my opinion, that if he's such a righteous person who trusts in Yahweh, let Yahweh rescue him from his current circumstances. The Hebrew word translated scorned in the NIV quoted above, or as Mike quotes from the New King James, reproach, is cherpah. And when used in the way it is in Psalm 22, the scorn or reproachfulness is meant to be resting upon a condition of shame or disgrace. However, in the context of the New Testament portrayals of Jesus, rejection rested upon something that was offered, but deliberately refused. Where is the offering in Psalm 22? There is not the sense that the individual of the psalm has brought something to the people that they then reject, something like claims of messiahship or the good news of the coming kingdom of God. People mocking, hurling insults, shaking their heads at the unfortunate author of Psalm 22 is rather a common theme in the Old Testament. In episodes 35 and 36 of my responses to Bob Duco and his assertions regarding the truth of the Bible, I explore this theme in other passages of the Hebrew Bible. But the Christian apologist isn't just equating the psalmist with Jesus as a person being merely mocked by others. He is specifically stating that the psalm is describing someone being rejected. This is really stretching the context of the psalm and misunderstanding the Hebrew word cherpah. We can certainly grant that both the author of Psalm 22 and Jesus were considered pious followers of Yahweh, but how many others could claim the same thing? But there's nothing in Psalm 22 about people specifically rejecting the subject, as Jesus was rejected by virtually everyone in the Passion narratives of the New Testament after having presented himself as the Messiah and the bringer of the good news of the kingdom of God. But also, and I note this in episode 37 of my series on Bob Duco's claims, the author of Psalm 22 states he was a devout follower of Yahweh from his birth, from the moment that his head rested on his mother's breast. This is a rather odd thing for an immortal being like Jesus, the second person of the so-called Trinity, merely another manifestation of God himself, to say. To place a beginning on when one became a follower of Yahweh makes sense for a mortal. It sounds perfectly fine for a normal person to say, "I've been following you from the time I was born." But how does this make any sense if this person is supposed to be the Logos of God, the Word that not only was with God from the beginning of time, but the Word which is actually God himself? How can this person have only become a follower of Yahweh from his birth if he was supposedly with God in the beginning, and that through him all things were made? It's just another detail from Psalm 22 that doesn't line up with the picture of Jesus given through the New Testament. So while you might be tempted to grant to the apologist that the subject of Psalm 22 being pious parallels that of Jesus being pious, when you highlight the details of how the author of Psalm 22 describes his own pious nature, the parallel begins to break down. The description of the pious individual from birth in the psalm makes perfect sense. If this person was just a normal, mortal human being and not the supernatural incarnation of an immortal, omnipresent deity. This person had merely been born into a pious family, had lived his life the best he could in worship of his God, and who now finds himself in dire circumstances, and who can't, like Job himself, make sense of what is happening to him, despite his lifelong devotion to his God. By day and by night he has suffered, and from his perspective, this pious individual cannot understand why his God has seemed to forsaken him. As I've noted time and again, this can only fit over the narrative of Jesus if you ignore the details and stretch the remaining points and hope no one else notices what you're doing. So with that in mind, I'll leave it to the viewers to decide if Mike has made a connection here between Psalm 22 and the narratives about Jesus from the New Testament. Is Psalm 22 referring to Jesus when it speaks directly of people who reject the individual of the psalm, while the psalmist himself has always been faithful to God as described in verses 6 through 10? Or do you think, as I do, that the details of those verses call that connection into question and make the apologist look like he's stretching it?